Hello and welcome to the Drone Law Today podcast. I'm your host, Steve Hogan. And though I'm a lawyer, nothing on this podcast is legal advice. Please seek counsel of your own choice before making decisions that impact yourself or your business. And here at the Drone Law Today podcast, we want to make sure that we are answering all your burning questions about drone law. So tell us what's on your mind. Head on over to dronelawtoday.com/survey. That's dronelawtoday.com/survey and tell us all your burning questions about drone law. And without further ado, let's jump right into today's episode. Thank you so much for listening.
Hey there, Drone Law Nation. Welcome back to another episode of Drone Law Today. I'm your host, Steve Hogan. And here on the podcast today, we have Lucas Armeña. Lucas joined the drone community in 2013 as a graduate researcher of the Emergency Management and Business Continuity Program at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, or NJIT. Lucas carved out a special topical area on emerging drone policy issues and legislation, and he also achieved the first flights of public UAS in New Jersey's national airspace as the Site Administrative Operations Officer. In 2015, along with two other members of NJIT's UAS working group, Lucas co-founded a company called Airlas LLC, which advises a growing clientele of public and private agencies as they stand up drone operations. This trio of New Jersey natives, providing close to 60 combined years of emergency service, were first responders during the events of September 11, 2001. And Lucas is a busy guy these days, and he has a lot of content that he puts out there on the internet, and we'll make sure to mention those places where you can find out what he's doing and put links in the show notes. And without further ado, Lucas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Hogan. Even larger than the Drone Nation, I'm a long-time listener of the podcast, and I'm very excited to be on with you to discuss relevant policy matters of drones today with your worldwide audience. Am I correct?
It is worldwide. It is worldwide. We get pings from Europe and all sorts of places, South America as well.
Great news. It's very exciting. I can't wait to see where this episode goes. And may I call you Steven?
Steven, just call me anything you want, just not late for dinner.
Excellent. So just a brief moment to your listeners. Steve's been humble about his book, and I'll just take a moment to urge you that if you haven't already, go ahead and download his free ebook. It's so motivational to those of us involved in the drone revolution. I read it from end to end without stopping, so great work, Steve.
Well, that's too kind. And I think you read it from end to end without stopping because it was pretty short.
Well, yeah, but absolutely. So this morning I finally had a chance to listen to the last couple of podcasts. And folks, if you've read the book, jump over to Amazon and write a review. I'm glad that you mentioned that in Q&A number 6, Steve, because I didn't even think to do that until you mentioned it. But I think germane here for the things we might discuss are the last two episodes I listened to. And quite frankly, episode 26 with Chris Parita is one for the books. Mr. Parita quite literally explained it all, and I'm certainly going back to have another listen.
Too kind. Yeah, Chris really dropped some knowledge on that episode. We were lucky to have him.
Very lucky. So, and before I forget, here's my disclaimer. I'm not an attorney, folks, but we'll circle back to that in a bit.
Sure. So tell us what you're doing in the drone space. I found you with online with everything that you were posting on LinkedIn and other places. And, I've got to say that the UAS fast reads that you've been posting on LinkedIn Pulse have been great. So tell us a little bit more about what you're doing in the drone space and how you came to be there. Thank you.
And for the most part, we all find each other in all the different information streams. But what I'm doing right now, aside from some other primary duties, is I basically have my hand in a little bit of everything with respect to policy matters related to drones. For instance, I'm involved as a stakeholder in the NTI-led effort as it pertains to best practices for commercial and private drone operators. The drafts under consideration pertain to non-binding best practices. Hopefully it covers the issues of privacy, transparency, and accountability, but since the NTIA is a non-regulatory agency within the Department of Commerce, I continue to build upon my strong suit, and that's where my involvement really doesn't feel like work to me because I enjoy it. And so what I mean by that is I involve myself in proposed rules and proposed legislation. I enjoy the process, if it were, and have helped advise drone-interested people interface with their regulators, their legislators, municipal, state, federal, along the eastern seaboard and across over into the Great Lakes when questionable verbiage pops up that may add to what the FAA, as we know, is calling the patchwork quilt.
Sure. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. It just sounded like we had a short out there. I think it's great that you're doing this policy work. Tell us a little bit more about the. You said NTIA. What's that, and what are you doing?
Absolutely. The NTIA is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and they are housed under the U.S. Department of Commerce. And this effort actually stems from the February 15th, 2015 presidential memorandum that went out to department heads at the federal level for each agency to come up with best practices. And there was a second part to that presidential memorandum which had called upon the NTIA to convene a multi-stakeholder process. And that process, we had our inaugural meeting in August. They ran monthly up until we came upon Christmas time, 4 hours each, and it involves stakeholders both in a room in D.C. As well as some virtual call-ins, which is what I do as well. And so the debate there, or the conversations there, is to come up with best practices that hopefully would be adopted by commercial entities as well as private users.
Yeah, I can't think of a more important endeavor in general in the drone world and in the drone law world specifically, because as everybody listening to this podcast knows or appreciates, the technology is moving so fast. The technology is moving faster than the regulation, faster than anybody can keep up with, and establishing best practices for trying to corral this wild thing that we call the drone industry is super important. So I applaud you for your work with the NTIA.
I haven't seen an industry move this quickly before. I mean, I have you?
No, and it's interesting, thinking back to former podcast guests, Professor Michael Frimkin out of the University of Miami was one of my first live guests.
Okay.
And I had him on because he wrote a paper called Self-Defense Against Robots and Drones, which was going into the idea of how much, if at all, the traditional notions of self-help and being able to defend yourself against an imminent threat would apply to drones flying over private property and how that would interact with different things. And in our conversation, not just about the paper, but about his background, he was around when the internet started.
Okay.
And he likened the drone industry to the growth of the internet. And I appreciate that analogy, but I've got to think that this technology is going even faster than that, because people are just buying them and becoming hobbyists like instantly. And, people are getting the idea of, hey, I can make a business out of this. I can take pictures of whatever and sell them, right?
Yeah.
And then you have a commercial operator, by the millions almost like instantly. It's like a microwave industry. So,
I have an interesting illustration that I came up with the other day. So I'm excited to be a part of the community as it grows, because here's the way that I see it. And right now I'm just talking in terms of small UAS here. So we started out in the 286 computer with 5 1/4 floppy drive era. And
I remember that when I got when I got a 486 tower, I was so happy.
Exactly, and that's what I was about to say. So right now, I see where we are in 2016 as we're recording this in February. That perhaps now we're in the 386, 486 area with the 3x5 floppy. So I'm sure many listeners can relate to those items. So it's that evolution from 2400 baud to where we are today.
Oh, man, you're bringing me back to my shareware days, man.
BBS
Well, actually, I had a catalog. My dad got a catalog, and, you could mail away for, like, shareware discs, so you got your computer programs in the mail, as retro as that sounds.
Oh, I remember those times.
I'm sure we're dating ourselves a little bit, but,
Well, it's good. It's good to come from a background where we do remember when technology was not... when call waiting was an innovation, and juxtaposing that to where we are now, we've come a long way.
Absolutely. Well, we jumped right in a little bit with the things that you're doing right now at a high level. Take us back to your superhero secret origin story and how you even found out what a drone was. Take us back there and tell us how you came to be who you are today.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you did mention that I founded that company, Airlas, in September with 2 colleagues. What we did was we saw an opportunity. You see, as inaugural members of the NJIT Applied Research UAS Working Group, we founded what I guess you'd call a drone startup. In order to continue our gains that we made in the drone space. And it's good to mention that the 3 of us come from diverse backgrounds, which is what makes the notion of our company being focused on efficiently, legally, and economically working in this new field. The key word here is efficiency for our clients, our potential clients. So it would help to go back and mention that I became involved with the working group in 2013. So I consider that to be my entry into the new industry. I think in your book you mentioned that it was a year earlier, but my origin story, that goes back much further. And so I'll just kind of quickly run it down. I was your guy that was always involved with student congress, local government committees. I was parliamentarian of my fraternity, a fan of Robert's Rules of Orders and very much appreciative of the process, allowing productive discussions with equal time given to all people with differing viewpoints in order to solve a problem. And so I think more significantly is my career background. In 2001, as you mentioned, I was in my first senior year at my undergrad alma mater. The campus is in Staten Island, and our dorms were on a hill that overlooked the New York Harbor and the World Trade Center. So the long story short on that one was I was a New Jersey EMT. I started riding ambulance at 16, who eventually found himself staged at an aid station on the West Side Highway a couple blocks over from the pile. And so what a lot of people forget about at that time, obviously it's very much ingrained in my mind, is 2 months later, the tri-state area basically relived another horror when American Airlines Flight 587 crashed in the Far Rockaways. So again, I was staged at another disaster site. In fact, I almost got my bachelor's degree in emergency management at the University of North Texas, but that's another story altogether. So for me, it's really not about disasters, though we should always be ready for them, but it's the fact that I worked everyday 911 EMS responses in urban and suburban areas. I also worked part-time for private ambulance services doing inter-facility transports. So I believe my value is the street-level interface. I'm a street guy. So those experiences were the foundations of my career. As I moved into working for nationally recognized litigation firms, I transferred my relatable and personable speak over to working with clients. So here I am in 2005. I'm working for a firm in South Carolina, and long story short on that one is I find myself staging in a small town called Graniteville, a litigation response team of attorneys, co-counsels, and paralegals that responding there following what was at the time the worst hazmat train derailment to help potential clients. So that's actually a write-up I'm working on now, piecing together the NTSB report and all, and I'm juxtaposing the 2005 emergency response against how the drone as a tool would have helped first responders if they had that available to them at that time. And I've kind of shifted between industries. Before I found the drone world, there's a part of me that's legal, that's medical, that's business, that's emergency. So another career worth mentioning is I also spent a couple of years as a human organ donor and tissue transplant coordinator. I basically work comfortably with the highest level decision makers, like lawyers and doctors and surgeons, all the way back down to the streets. So that's the patients, the clients, that's first responders, families that I approach for consent for organ and tissue donation to occur. So couple that with my passion for the process of government, and that's basically where I fit in. I've said it to close friends, and I'll say it here for your listeners. I see myself as a good Samaritan in the drone world. I'm focused on the operations surrounding life-saving, life safety, and I know humanitarians are doing fantastic work around the world with drones, but I'm passionate about everyday responses, drones as tools that help our everyday heroes. So let's take that and apply that to me completing my master's in emergency management and business continuity at NJIT this May. That's where I entered the drone world in 2013. It was my first class. My professor at the time, he had us read a white paper he co-authored as it relates to medium and high altitude, long endurance drones. And we should think of the context at that time too, Steve. So what I mean by that is, here I was reading a white paper on using drones in New Jersey to enhance emergency response. A no-brainer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we also can't forget what the word drone meant to most Americans and our friends overseas.
Exactly.
That's
right. The D word, I don't run away from it. And, there was a minor controversy a few years ago about whether the community should try to rebrand as UAS or whatever. And it seems like the D word has won out. And but as people become more familiar with what these things are, the meaning is shifting. So that pop culture term means a different thing now than it did even 2 years ago. So I take your point on that.
And almost like our European and Australian friends, they still refer to their cell phones as mobiles. So maybe that, we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. But so here I am. I'm reading this paper. And in my consciousness, at least, is the what? Almost 13-hour filibuster by Senator Rand Paul earlier that year. Mainly, that filibuster surrounded drone attacks. So you kept hearing drone attacks, targeting and killing Americans on American soil. So, yeah, contextual reflection helps here, because now here we are in 2016, and people are questioning why the federal government struggles with drone integration into NAS, even with ephemeral and 333s and so much innovation happening so quickly. So just to give you the best full origin story, I knew it would take a lot of time to frame drone use for adoption. So to get to this point, what I did was I carved out that special topical area that you mentioned. So it's emerging policy issues and legislation of drones, federal and state. I coordinated the working group's 71-page comment to the NPRM. I always wanted to be one of the people who contributed to text that would become rules, and in some sense, I actually did. So in the registration IFR, a part that I wrote regarding numbering made it there, and this was me using some street knowledge here. It was suggesting the use of NX, November X-ray, so that whether you're a paralegal looking at a spreadsheet or a flight controller looking at the scopes, you could differentiate just by a quick glance that this flight has no souls on board. That's a drone.
Let me reflect back something here, and I think that's a really neat way to for you to have come into this industry. From the street level view, the EMT, really getting your hands dirty, making the world better, and now contributing on a policy level, which I think is really unique. You bring a really unique perspective to these things, and one thing I want to highlight there is that you did submit a comment on the NPRM. And listeners, if you don't know what the NPRM is or stands for, that means Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. And you'll recall that as we sit here in 2016, we do not have a drone rule on the books. We still don't. And the FAA is working away on it, but what they're working away on is the text that they put out there in the world in the form of an NPRM, which tells the world this is what we, the FAA, to personify myself in that position, is, it was a little awkward, but we'll go with it, to tell the world what the FAA is thinking of putting on the books as a rule. And there was
they're adding what they're calling Part 107.
Right. And so that text was out there, and a comment period was open. Now, listeners out there, you all, if you're listening to this podcast, you're in the top 1% of people that know anything about drone law in this country. So it's important that when these things come up, that you submit comments, that you take the initiative of telling the government regulator what you think. And the reason I bring this up is that before the rule is final again, there's probably going to be some kind of comment period. And even if not on this one, certainly when the next round of rules comes in, there's going to be another comment period and another comment period. That's just how it works. And the best thing that could happen is for informed people to submit comments. And it's mechanically easy. You just go to a site called regulations.gov, find the thing you want to comment on, and they're very easy to use search bar, and then submit your comment. And the hard part is in creating something that brings value, like Lucas said that he did with his substantial submission to that. So listeners, keep that in mind. You do have a voice, and it needs to be heard.
Be a part of the process. Absolutely. That's what you need to do. And here's another thing that I mentioned. I have several sections in the NPRM. The proposal, of course, as we know, is for under 55 pounds. So the distinction here, as you mentioned in the beginning when you introduced me, is I was part of the first flights of public drones in New Jersey's NAS. So I'm both below 55 pounds and above 55 pounds. I'm public and civil aircraft oriented, and that's why I continue to monitor the Federal Register. And folks, Steve is absolutely correct. Be a part of the process. It's a very easy avenue for you to just make a comment on anything that you see, whether you agree or disagree.
Absolutely, and it does bring value. It absolutely does. So we appreciate you being involved in that. Tell us a little bit more about what you're doing with your company, Airlas. Airlas. I keep wanting to say Airlas because it's spelled AIRLAS.
I think we're still trying to figure it out right now. I'm excited that we founded that company, and as you can tell, my area is policy and legislative matters. The other two partners, they come from other great careers, including telecommunications and technology. So, we founded the company in September, which in dog years is a little older, and I guess in drone years is maybe even older than that. We're analysts, we're advisors, consultants. Apply the word you'd like for now, because the 333s that we have are still in the pike. And have been for a while. That's a whole other topic. But, we'll stand up operations.
Slowly but surely.
Exactly. We're just in that holding pattern. But, the thing that can make us unique here is our policy component from other I guess, drone startups, drone companies. We're focusing on some states, just to name a couple, New Jersey and Delaware. But since we've only been really working on it since September, we've been very busy meeting with clients, potential clients, friends, and that stretches all the way to a trip that we took all the way up into New England, past Boston. As you're aware, I kind of stretch into the southeast, I think that's how we connected. Actually, I maybe sent you after finding you on LinkedIn. I think you had written a post where you tagged me. I sent you a primer for emergency services where I took DHS's 14-page best practices document and put it into a brief summary for first responders. You remember that document?
Yeah. You know, it's been a while, but yeah, that was super quality, and I thought, this guy, I need to get to know him better.
So that's what we're doing. So yeah, we can go in depth with our clients and friends about IS strategies and models to attain and sustain your competitive advantage. Yeah, but the thing here about the three of us is we're unique in the sense that all three of us are street level interfaced. That, as you mentioned before, that we all were responders, that we not only professionally are able to interface with high level people, but we also know how to speak with people as a person. So, you know, part of it is we're focusing in on first responders, life-saving, but of course, with my experience, that includes liability issues, attorneys, and insurers. We're very much trying to get into the insurance adjuster phase as well. We aim to make the process and operations of drones simple for our clients and our friends.
That's excellent, man. That's excellent. Well, with your background in policy at both the state and federal level as applied to drones, I'm going to ask you the question I like to ask every guest.
Okay.
We know there's a lot of things going on right now in the drone law world. For you, what's top of mind as the most, the more significant things that are going on that people need to be aware of at either the state or the federal level?
Great question. Let's talk about congressional mandates, shall we, Steve?
Go for it.
Again, I was so happy it was mentioned when I listened to Mr. Parita's podcast this morning. Now, folks, why would FAA even think of addressing anything outside of their statutory jurisdiction? You know, so absolutely, their domain is squarely in aviation safety and navigable airspace. So here, everyone, just here's the example that I use. Take a look at the back of your cell phone, because I write about this in the university's comment to the NPRM. Well, at least for me, I have a phone with a removable back, so you'd have to take a look inside. But you see all these symbols, okay? So you might see CE. That indicates that it's the sale is approved in the European Union, but at the very least, there's probably an FCC symbol in there somewhere. You see, I see the issue of allowing drones to flourish in today's economy in terms of airspace and airwaves. So obviously regulation is necessary. I agree with that. We don't want to compromise safety. But have all of the jurisdictional agencies been activated or congressionally mandated in this task? There's even one that I just learned of when I heard an earlier guest of yours, Elizabeth Wharton, in episode 23, the FTC. Yeah, I still have to read up on that one. But here's where I submit to you and the listeners that there was a hearing in July 2013 before the House Subcommittee on Oversight, Investigations, and Management. That was of the House Committee on Homeland Security. And key here is a long dialogue that they had, which I don't think has ever been addressed since. The question that was posed during the hearing was, and I'm gonna go ahead and get into a little kind of, I guess, aviation speak. With the difference of military GPS and civilian GPS not being secure, what does this mean for these ADS-B final rules that are supposed to be taking place in 2020? And then furthermore, in that same hearing, and by the way, it should be indicative that the title of the hearing was Using Unmanned Aerial Systems Within the Homeland, Security Game Changer. So here's where I highlight the most important topic for me in drone law right now is let's talk security, specifically cybersecurity. Let's talk about which agency really should have the lead on this, because I see this as much more. We're not just talking about aviation. We're talking about aviation right now, but I see this much more as a much more larger thing when you deal with unmanned systems in general. So we talk about driverless cars. We talk about submersibles. We talk about the fact that the FAA, and this is a quote from the one of the sheriff's deputies that testified there, he mentioned that the FAA does not have the experience in its application, and they have no real understanding regarding the critical mission aspect of UAS operations. So they're not going to go outside of their domain when it comes to security, cybersecurity, and might I also mention, let's talk about the security of data, sensors, systems, the risk management. So, and also liability for not implementing security protocols. So I'd expect, and from what I heard from Ms. Wharton in that podcast, I'd expect FTC to jump into that drone battle. Companies who fail to implement basic security protocols. So again, military GPS, civilian GPS, data breaches, hacked aircraft systems. I mean, the spotlight was put on when I forgot, it was either Iraq or Iran, spoofed the GPS on one of our military drones and was able to take it down and control it. So what does that mean for security? That's what we need to really start to think about. Not just air safety, but the security of the systems that we're using for the drones.
Oh man, that is an awesome perspective, and I'm glad you mentioned my interview with Elizabeth Wharton, because she, she's all over that angle of drones as just another part of the Internet of Things.
Mm-hmm.
Not just simply an aviation resource. And oh gosh, it's almost like a trip back through former podcast guests here. But there was another guest we had on, Dave Lincoln.
Yes, and then as a side note, he actually spent time with me on the same runway in January for those first flights. I know him in person.
Small world, isn't it?
Small world.
But the interesting thing about his discussion was talking about, and I know this is a review for you, but for the benefit of the audience, he talked about the role that the Department of Commerce, the Federal Department of Commerce, and the Federal Department of State have in drone actions, and with all this alphabet soup of agencies, not just the FAA that's involved. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, especially to anyone who's listening who's a drone startup or drone lawyers that are trying to advise drone startups or established companies that want to use these things. All of this potential regulatory thicket is all potential right now. I mean, there's some strings, tendrils, if you will, poking out of the ground, but it's going to happen, and it's going to happen right in front of our eyes. So this is, drone law has changed a lot in the past few years, and it's just going to keep changing a lot going forward. So I think it's incumbent on all of us who care about the industry to stay on top of things, to stay on top of these changes. And, it brings to mind just last week from where we're sitting here at the beginning of February, I was down in Orlando speaking to a bunch of lawyers that do environmental and land use law.
I saw that looked like it was an exciting presentation. I saw that photo of you.
Oh, yeah, that I gave a co-presentation with another lawyer here in Tallahassee, with who's going to be on the podcast probably in March to talk about that specific issue on drones and land use and environmental law. And when I got up there, and one of my last slides was what other federal agencies are involved, and just roll down the alphabet soup of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, like you mentioned, the FCC, all that's the wavelengths that you were talking about, the Department of State, Department of Commerce, yada yada yada. I mean, it's almost head spinning when you think about it like that.
On top of that, and again, we know I'm not a lawyer, but on top of that, let's also not forget the Supreme Court. Yeah, so we have technology precedents for U.S. v. Jones, Kylo versus U.S. We can go into the whole Florida v. Riley, Cosby, all of those. So that's another aspect to it. But just because I happen to have this in front of me from that July 2013 hearing, so there were 5 entities that were explored when it came to who should be the lead agency when it comes to integrating drones, who can work with the FAA. The 5 that were listed was the DHS Office of State and Local Law Enforcement, DHS Office of Privacy, TSA, DHS at headquarters, the Office of Policy, and the Office of Infrastructure Protection. So that kind of
and DHS there, that's Department of Homeland Security, correct?
Correct, yes. So that kind of gets you thinking in the direction of, all right, so DHS has all of these agencies tucked within it, and they do have a good handle on cybersecurity. They work well. They work well with NASA and all their other partners. So I just kind of threw those names out that were identified during the hearing just for consideration by the listeners.
Man, this is going to be a wild thing going forward. I think we'll have to check back in, especially as the public safety issues come to the fore at both the state and federal levels. And one thing we haven't dealt with on this podcast, and we are going to this year, is the interaction between drone technology and Fourth Amendment searches. That's something that we just haven't touched on. We just haven't had occasion, haven't had I think the only criminal lawyer we've had on is James Mackler, and we didn't really get into that issue. So we are going to address those things, and that's the genesis of those cases that you rattled off, the Florida v. Riley and all that. I think it's going to be interesting to see the new technology aspect of this, and I don't want to get too deep into this rabbit hole.
Absolutely.
But the new technology aspect and the familiarity with technology and how that's going to change that Fourth Amendment, what is a search analysis, because that was the point, and I always mispronounce this, but the Keolo case with...
Yeah, I still don't know how to pronounce that. I know how to write it.
yeah. When I have to give a presentation on weird sounding case names, there is a resource actually that's out there online. How do I pronounce this case? So there is a right way to say it. But that was the Supreme Court case with thermal imaging, where you could get an image of what was going on inside a house, and that drew a line about that wasn't kosher under a Fourth Amendment analysis. But really, when you start breaking that down in the case law that it was based on, it's almost a question of familiarity, or the public's familiarity with a technology as the basis of whether something is an unreasonable search or seizure, which is just so squishy. And there's some really interesting professors out there, legal scholars, that are pushing back against that whole even conception of whether or not the Fourth Amendment search and seizure idea needs to be refocused entirely and not even based on a privacy sort of analysis. So it's going to be an interesting thing going forward. And listeners, I apologize if I just sounded like I was talking gibberish.
Oh,
but,
no, not at all. Because
I swear it'll make sense later this year.
Well,
okay?
I mean, if I remember correctly, this it also has to deal with the definition of search, particularly when they use that FLIR from a public vantage point. The heat that was coming out, whether or not a warrant was required at the time. So there are certainly some interesting technology questions. And since you mentioned you're speaking with at the Florida thing, you said a week or so ago. I think it was last week.
Yeah, it's last week from where we sit here. Yeah.
Yep. So actually, same here. Last week, I think you may have been aware that I traveled to the capital area of North Carolina, specifically Durham. That area is known as the Research Triangle area, or just the Triangle area. And what they did was they hosted an executive exchange, and they had not only a keynote speaker, but they had a legal panel, which involved one of the panelists was a state representative. And 4 attorneys that dealt with certain areas in their domain of drones, as well as an opportunities panel. And I just need to let the listeners know that there is very much a flourishing environment of drone world here in North Carolina, because the quick breakdown, we have in North Carolina 73 333 companies. You have Precision Hawk headquartered out of here, and Alaris. So they're doing production and system development here. There's a handful of small companies doing fabrication, parts, and supplies. There's another dozen or so companies doing research on technologies. And to the credit of North Carolina, what they did was not a couple years ago, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, they stood up an entity under North Carolina State University called the Next Generation Air Transportation Center. And what they are is they're a regional knowledge source for UAS and next-gen activities. So, I give them credit for reaching out to local industry, and believe it or not, they're actually, well, not believe it or not, but a congratulatory note to them is they're also members of the Assure Alliance. So that's part of the Center of Excellence.
Excellent.
There's a lot going on in North Carolina.
Absolutely, man. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. So as we wrap this up, how can people find out more about you and what you're doing?
Absolutely. So again, company's aim is efficiency, and so is mine. So this is simple. You can either reach me on Twitter through my Twitter handle. That's LAA007. You can catch my UAS Fast Read posts on LinkedIn, or give me a ring at Airlas. The number is 302-UAS-7-FLY.
Wonderful, and we'll put links to all that in the show notes, make it real easy. Well, Lucas, thank you for your time today, and we'll have to check back in.
Absolutely. I look forward to it, and I appreciate having you invited me onto the podcast.
All right, man. We'll see you around the way.
And that's our episode. Thank you for listening to Drone Law Today, and thank you for heading over to iTunes and leaving your ratings and reviews. That helps us out so much, and we really appreciate it. Please head over to dronelawtoday.com/survey and tell us what's on your mind about drone law. Tell us all your burning questions, and we'll do our best to answer everything. That's dronelawtoday.com/survey. This podcast is not legal advice. Please seek counsel of your own choosing before making decisions that impact yourself or your business. And this is Steve Hogan signing off from today's episode. It's been an honor to speak with you today about the changing world of drone law. Until next time, keep on flying.